The Compromise of 1850 had a little known but drastic impact on the United States course of history. And we're going to talk in the next chapter specifically why. So hold on to that thought. The Compromise of 1850 worked temporarily to kind of temper sectional thoughts and conflict in the 1850s, a very important decade for one particular region of the United States, because the impending decade, the following decade, the 1860s, um, you'd see something drastic in American history. So the Compromise of 1850 was very important. So there was just this uneasy truth, or truce rather, that existed between Northerners and Southerners, abolitionists and pro-slave folks. But one thing that was continuously moving were the applications from territories for statehood in the United States. And the conversations continued about popular sovereignty and how things might be decided, which states, new states, would be admitted as free and slave. Um, Railroads continued to build around this time. Railroads had been advented in the prior decades, and they were especially big among northern cities. So trains from New York to Chicago, to New York to Washington, D.C., or any place like that were very big. But now, since we have this massive swath out southwest, what do you do if you're going to transport goods out to California or Arizona or West Texas or someplace like that? So the idea and support for a transcontinental railroad became important in the early 1850s. There was just a problem with where you might place it. So, say for example, uh, you may have a rail yard shipping goods from El Paso, which is on the further edge of far west Texas, and you might want to take that by train to Los Angeles in Southern California. Okay. Um, One problem: the most efficient pathway from a geographical standpoint, even though you have, by Treaty of the Guadalupe Hidalgo, obtained a huge swath of the current American Southwest. There was one small portion, southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, that remained a part of Mexico. It's right in the middle where a rail line could go across the entire continent. So you would have to circumvent part of Mexico, an inefficient way of bringing things in and around from a geographic standpoint. So that southern route was deemed as possibly being an issue. So Northerners and others who favored transcontinental railroad lobbied for the idea of maybe approaching Mexico once again for possible territorial expansion. So, um, this time we were desperately not wanting a war with Mexico. We'd had enough of that in the 5 to 7 years prior. Mexico was in its still whipping tailwind of issues. So, the United States approached um, Mexico by sending James Gadsden, a Southern railroad industrialist, to negotiate a purchase of about 30,000 acres of land in modern day southern Arizona, south of the Gila River, and southwest New Mexico. So, modern day Tucson, Arizona, is in that territory, that swath of land. And we approached Mexico, and he persuaded the Mexican government to accept $10 million for an exchange of that strip of land. Okay? That part of Arizona and New Mexico. They agreed, and that is what we know as the Gadsden Purchase. That was in 1853, and that added land that could now directly connect railroads from far west Texas to Southern California without any border to impede. So, from that standpoint, the United States gained its final continental territory. Alaska and Hawaii and other things come a little bit later in American history. But as far as the lower 48, you now have the current geographical representation of the United States. The Gadsden Purchase is that final puzzle piece. So you have your original 13 colonies that expanded after the United States won our war for independence in the Treaty of Paris, basically expanded the United States to the Mississippi River. The Louisiana Purchase, we purchased from Napoleon that next huge swath, basically the current Midwest all the way through the Great Plains, down to Louisiana and the Gulf. Florida, Adams-on-East Treaty. And then, of course, Texas. And then, of course, Oregon and the rest of the West, Treaty of Guadalupe and the final Gadsden Purchase. That's how the United States comes together. If you've ever wondered how the states get their shape, why do the states look the way they do? You can do various different research online. A lot of those political boundaries among states are made based upon geographic barriers and other times politics as related to resources. Some states were adamant that they have water resources or anything else and they needed to reshape their state because of it. It's pretty interesting. Texas is very fortunate not only to have a Gulf Coast, we have a coastline basically from Port Arthur down to Brownsville. We also have some rivers that provide water sources for hundreds of miles. We have a vast ocean of oil underneath Texas soil. Even though oil prices have come falling down as of late, they'll rebound. Texas public universities benefit from Texas oil money. You're welcome, University of Texas. You're welcome, Texas A&M University. Oil has allowed and enabled much of your success. Okay. Otherwise, though, other things are going in because as states are applying for statehood, some, or territories are applying for statehood, that is, some territories that have been around since the Louisiana Purchase, almost 50 years prior, are still not states yet. More specifically, the region of the United States that comprised the two states of Kansas and Nebraska had not been declared as states yet. They hadn't applied for statehood. They hadn't been granted statehood. That raises a question, just like the Gadsden Purchase raises questions. The Gadsden Purchase raised another question about, did we just expand slavery inadvertently? It is south of the Missouri Compromise line. Did we just allow for an expansion of slavery? Well, that question also rears its head when the Nebraska Territory, which is Nebraska, parts of Iowa, Missouri, and other parts of Kansas, they have an opportunity to possibly become slave states. And since the territory had once been thought as being poor for agriculture, was actually deemed for pretty decent for agriculture based upon certain seasonal cycles. Okay, you might now have an opportunity to make and formalize a few different states out of this territory. And maybe in the spirit of the Missouri Compromise, maybe you would make one state free and the other one would perhaps be a slave state. And it was thought that Kansas, once admitted to the Union, would probably be that slave state. After all, it was directly to the west of slave state Missouri, and it was a little further south than Nebraska, so it just kind of made sense that if one were a slave state and the other one were a free state, it would be Nebraska. Well, not all of those folks were necessarily on board with that. So abolitionists, especially from up north, gave some pretty severe pushback about that. And they came up with the idea, hey, instead of just doing a 50-50, one state is free, the other one's slave, how about we let them decide for themselves perhaps how that might happen? So, from that standpoint, you have the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which would allow residents of Kansas and Nebraska, if they themselves wanted slavery. Okay? You're enabling states' rights at this point, okay? Which is kind of what we want in the first place, so a lot of people argue anyway, right? Okay? So the Kansas Nebraska Act basically says, hey, Kansas, Nebraska, you have the authority yourselves to decide if slavery should be permitted there. And so, from that standpoint, that now furthers a different cause. Because, as I just mentioned, Kansas is right next to slave state Missouri. Okay. Kansas would actually put on a vote to see if they should allow slaves. The problem is, at the time of the vote, only about 1,000 people lived in the entire area that we now know as Kansas. Well, in order to sway the vote, you had some unruly Missourians make their way on into Kansas and actually vote in the Kansas election. And invariably, the people who came to Kansas from Missouri to vote were pro-slavery. They didn't want another northern state to influence the anti-slavery movement. They wanted another friendly and compassionate slave state. So, from that perspective, you have Missourians trying to influence the Kansas election. In response to that, you have some people in Kansas who see what the Missourians are doing, and they create a separate provisional government and try to have themselves recognized by the federal government as the actual entity that should represent Kansas. Well, you have various different folks in the federal government and the legislatures who send a contingency actually from Missouri to arrest these anti-slavery Kansans. Um, and they destroyed several different buildings, including the governor's house, various different things. And Kansans wanted retribution. So you have John Brown, a Kansas abolitionist who dedicated his life, and the end of his life definitely, for the case of abolitionism and abolishing slavery once and for all. He led some forces into Missouri, um, and skirmishes happened. People died. There's a famous uh, rivalry between the University of Missouri and the University of Kansas that's known as the Border War that largely discusses the idea of the conflict between Missouri and Kansas in the 1850s so as to enable Kansas to become a slave state and the people who fought against that and whatnot. Okay? Um, John Brown's abolitionists murdered 5 pro-slavery uh, lobbyists, and further violence ensued. So you have kind of this border war, the symbol of a bleeding Kansas, people fighting for the abolition of slavery. If anything else, no slavery in Kansas. That kind of pointed the direction of the state of Kansas, if you will. So if you see any ideologies behind bleeding Kansas or border war, that's what it's about. Remember this: Kansas tried to keep slavery out. Missouri, slave state. That's all you need to know. Okay. Um, Other things were going on because you have more of a free soil ideology. As I mentioned, there was the Free Soil Party, which believed in the idea that new states should be admitted as non-slave states. They're free states. Okay. You have a large movement, largely centered around this new political party. As your Whigs go down, as your know nothings go down, as your Democrats are split all over the place, you have this new party that is running on a platform of slave abolition. We're going to abolish slavery. Their nickname was the Grand Old Party. We know them today as the Republican Party. So they have their foundation as the anti-slavery political party. They're the party of Abe Lincoln. Okay, we're going to talk about him in a second. Oddly enough, there were people in the South who tried to develop an intellectual defense of slavery, if you will, the pro-slavery argument. People who are advocating that um, it is just, it is right that you have the Southern society have cheap labor because, one, that's how their entire heritage is built around agricultural output revolving cheap labor. But then also, you have a refined, laid back Southern culture that is definitely different than the individualistic and even hedonistic Northern culture. That in itself is better. The fact that black people and white people can live together in the South, um, whether it's slave or not. Otherwise, though, the slaves oftentimes enjoy better living and working conditions than Northern factory workers. So, while they are commodities, they are human beings that are owned, they have it better. And because of that, that boons the idea of there being a defense of slavery. The last and more sinister aspect of the pro-slavery argument was that, well, black people are inferior to white people. They need white people to keep them in place because they cannot, uh, they're unfit, if you will, to take care of themselves. So their natural place is submissive to the white man, and we will actually help them. It's compassionate to enslave them. You see? That's a common defense, an intellectual defense, because how can these people exercise rights of citizenship when they are unfit to care for themselves? So their natural place is submissive to the white man. This was a prevailing thought among those who defended slavery at the time. We know that today to obviously not be true, but that was a common defense of the time so as to make some sort of defense, an elaborate defense of biological inferiority of black people. And if you're a white Southerner, like I've mentioned in prior videos, you had to buy into it. Your whole economy was based upon it. So whether you believed it or not, it became your truth.